Right, evening everybody. It is Tuesday, 27th of September, but I think because I've got ahead of myself, this potentially isn't going to be till Thursday, I think, whatever. Anyway, Scotch blended malts, done, kaput, not many of them, and we shall crack on now with moving into Irish whiskey. I'm not even going to try and do an Irish accent because it could get me into trouble. Now I was going to do Irish whiskey in alphabetical order, simply because I couldn't figure out any other order to do it. So I've got a little spreadsheet and I thought, right, alphabetical order, A to Z, the whole lot, and we'll start there. But there is one called Feckin Irish Whiskey, so it seems daft not to start with that one. And we shall do a run of Feckin Irish Whiskies, which is this sample here, which was from Chris and Lindsay Cook. Here's Chris now, thank you very much for this. And seeing as this is the first one of the Irish whiskies, I thought I might just try and give you a quick little rundown in terms of Irish whiskey and what differentiates it to Scotch in particular. Irish whiskey was really popular up to about the turn of the 1900s, so up to about the late 1800s. Irish whiskey was huge, really big in America, and arguably bigger than Scotch. And then sort of at the turn of the 1900s, it started to flip on its head. Now, what we're finding now recently is Irish is kind of having a bit of a revival, almost on the coattails of Scotch. Bourbon's becoming big. People are starting to look away from Scotch and are starting to move towards US whiskies and Irish. And Irish whiskey recently, particularly in the last few years, is starting to get a bit of a revival, and we're finding new distilleries in Ireland are popping up left, right and centre. So Irish whiskey can come in three forms, a bit like Scotch. So whereas with Scotch you've got blended Scotch whiskey, which is malt and grain, you've got blended malt Scotch whiskey, which is malt whiskies from various distilleries, and then single malt. With Irish whiskey you can have single malt, you can have blended Irish whiskey, which is malt and grain, and then there's something called it's either pure pot still or Irish pot still, or essentially pot still whiskies. Now this is slightly different to Scotch in that not only do they use malted barley, but they also use unmalted barley, and this is kind of the key differential between Scotch and Irish, because it tends to give it, I found personally, a slightly juicier flavour. Irish whiskey tends to be, not all the time, but more often than not, is triple distilled, whereas a lot of Scotch whiskies, single malts in particular, with the exception of one or two, I mean Auchentoshan is the obvious one, tends to be double distilled and that's it, whereas Irish tends to be triple distilled. Now what this is meaning is that you take your you take your mash and you distill it, and there are still kind of impurities in there and it's a bit of a kind of thicker spirit. So what you tend to do is that runoff you actually distill again, and you end up with a slightly a purer, cleaner spirit that's running off that second time. Now there are still some elements in there that you might want to distill out. This is where chill filtration comes in Scotch. And if you distill it more and more and more, you're actually getting a lot lighter spirit, but really not a lot of flavour out of it as well. It's my tumble dryer. Whereas Irish tends to do that third time, and it results in a naturally lighter spirit. So Irish whiskies as a whole, and it's not, this is a sweeping generalisation, it's not all Irish whiskies, but as a whole, Irish whiskies tend to be smoother, lighter to drink, rather than Scotch, which is a little bit heavier. Irish whiskies in the main tend not to use any peat. There are one or two peated versions, and I've got one coming up with Connemara, which is a fairly heavily peated Irish whiskey. But generally you'll find them slightly smoother, slightly lighter, slightly easier to drink. Now, I'm going to try and cut and paste this map, which is from the Wikipedia page here, and this shows you the as of 2015, so last year, the Irish whiskey distilleries that are in operation. However, quite a few of those were only opened in the last 2 or 3 years, so we're not actually at the stage of any released, because it needs to be matured for at least 3 years. So about 5 years ago, there was literally 4 Irish whiskey distilleries, and that was it. There was Bushmills, which was the only one in Northern Ireland. There was Cooley's, which is on the west coast, just underneath the Northern Ireland border. There was the Kilbeggan distillery, which I think was also known as Locks at one point, which is kind of slap bang in the middle of the whole island itself. And then there was the Middleton distillery, which was near the south coast. Now, we now have, there's the Tullamore distillery, which was near the Kilbeggan distillery in the centre of the country. That was opened in 2014. Teeling, which I have covered in earlier on in the challenge, they actually opened a new distillery last year in the centre of Dublin. Previously, they were actually buying stock from, I can't remember which one it was, but they were buying distilleries from one of the others. Dingle, which is the southwest, south, let me look at the map, southwest. Yes, southwest, sorry, I said Cooley was on the west coast, didn't I? It's the east coast, my geography's all over the place. Cooley, east coast, just south of the border. Dingle's on the southwest coast. The Connaught Whiskey Company, which is in County Mayo, which is not on this map, but it's actually in the northwest coast, sort of where that shoulder bit comes out. You've got the Glendalough, or Glendalough, however it's pronounced, which is just south of Dublin. That was opened in 2013. You've got the Alltech Craft Distillery, which apparently opened in 2012, but I've never heard of anything from that. And then you've got the Blackwater Distillery, which is on the south coast again, just a little bit further up from Middleton. Again, that opened last year. And there are even more distilleries that are going to be opening. So Irish whiskey, from a relatively small number of distilleries, it's just exploded in the last 3-4 years, and there's distilleries popping up everywhere. Now, what you used to find was there were a lot of distilleries a lot of Irish whiskies with various brand names that were being bought, stock was being made at these 4 distilleries. It was these 4 that were supplying all these brands. So you kind of had the indication or the impression there were a lot of Irish distilleries, and there weren't. It was just these various brands were buying stock from these 4 distilleries and bottling it up under their own label. Now, there is another distillery, which I've not mentioned, which was on that map, and that's called the Ecklinville Distillery. And this is a new distillery that opened in 2013, and potentially any day now their first bottlings will be released. And this was actually a distillery that was opened and founded by the guy who created Feckin Irish Whiskey, who is this guy, and his name is Shane Braniff. He's a Northern Irishman that launched Feckin Irish Whiskey in 2005, and up to the point where he's got his own stock. He was actually taking the blended whiskey, and it's a blended whiskey, so it's a combination of malt and grain, from the Cooley distillery, which is the one on the east coast, just south of the Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland border. Hang on, Republic of Ireland, Northern Ireland border. So this was a blended whiskey that, obviously, Feckin Irish Whiskey, it stands out a mile. It's an instantly recognisable name. Apparently, it's really big in America. I was about to say huge. I don't quite know how big it is in America, but it's a big seller in America. And since he launched Feckin Irish Whiskey, his aim has been to have a new distillery. This is in Northern Ireland. This is the first distillery to be granted a license to distill in, they're quoting it as 130 years. It's basically the second distillery in Northern Ireland, the other one being obviously Bushmills. So they were buying stock from Cooley. They're potentially at the point of being able to make it themselves because they are distilling. This is what the bottle looks like. And you're looking at about, well, Master and Malt are selling this for about 26 quid. So it's around sort of 25 quid. I can imagine it could even be dollars for pounds in America. But it's one of those where, it's a jokey name, and it's the sort of thing where, to be perfectly honest, if I saw it on a shelf, I'd probably steer clear of it, because it kind of gives me the impression that it's a jokey, not a lot of care taken over the actual spirit itself. Likewise, we used to get, I don't know if you still do, but you used to get those bottles of wine that was old git and fat bastard and everything like that, and it was more people buying it for presents rather than actually going, I've heard it's a really good wine. It's like, oh, it's called Old Git, I'm going to buy it for my dad's birthday and all that lot. And it's kind of the same with this in terms of the name. It's called Feckin Irish Whiskey. This is Father Jack from the Father Ted TV show. If you've never seen Father Ted, I implore you to see it. It's one of the best all-time classic comedies on TV ever. It's absolutely brilliant. And his catchphrase was "feck off." He was if you've never seen it, Father Ted was I can't remember the actor's name, but he sadly died. He was stuck on an island. Father Ted Crilly was on Craggy Island. It was called, and it was him. There was Father Dougal, who was played by stand-up comedian Ardlo Hanlon, who was just thick but funny and innocent and a bit daft. He had a housekeeper whose name I can't remember, who was insisted on offering everybody cups of tea. And then Father Jack was the other of the three. He was the other priest that was an alcoholic. He used to sit in a armchair and tell everybody to feck off. And I actually got into trouble at school once. When I was in the sixth form at school, for PE, we could wear whatever we wanted as PE kit, and I had a big t-shirt with Father Jack's face on it with "feck off" written underneath, and my PE teacher went ape because he didn't know what Father Ted was. He had no idea, and he basically tried to put me in detention until one of the other teachers turned around and went, "Everybody knows Father Ted. How do you not know what Father Ted is? Get a life, get a grip, get over yourself." So, Feckin Irish Whiskey. Is this whiskey the name rather than the whiskey itself? Is this not a joke whiskey, but is this one where you're buying it because it's got a funny label rather than it's any good? Let's find out. So, colour, a little bit pale actually, a bit paler than I was expecting. It's kind of a not quite dessert white wine, but it looks a little bit wishy-washy. Now, on the nose straight away is this kind of juiciness that I associate with Irish whiskey. It's something that and you'll probably find I'm going to say the same thing pretty much through most of the Irish whiskies that I'll do, because it's something I always go to instantly, which is blackcurrant, starburst, opal fruits, whatever you call them. But it's very, very juicy, but it's very, very kind of blackcurranty, blackberry, that sort of feel to it. And it's there, it's very much there. But there's also a little bit of a metallic edge from, I'm guessing, the grain whiskey as well. It's a little bit sharp, but it's not too overpowering. And there is a blackcurrant juiciness to it, quite prevalent actually on the palate. Blimey. That really is blackcurrant through and through. Very much so. Irish whiskey I always describe as juicy. It's kind of mouth-watering, and this one is. It's a little bit sharp. It's just a little bit too sharp. If it was knocked down just a touch, just that grain element is just a little bit too overpowering. If it mellowed out ever so slightly and just soften that sharpness, it would actually be a really, really good whiskey. But it's so mouth-watering. It's very, very juicy. It very much is a blackcurrant opal fruit. It's weird. There's a kick at the back of the throat, but it's not overpowering. It's quite warming. It's very pleasant. It's more on the palate is the sharpness that's only very, very slightly too sharp, and it's just a little bit too much of an edge. It's a little bit flabby in the middle as well. The finish kind of comes back a little bit, but there's a moment in the middle where it starts off juicy and then it sort of just flattens out and goes a little bit flat, and then as you swallow back down, there's a warmth that comes back through. It's eminently drinkable. I wouldn't call it complex. It's probably a good mixer. I think they kind of push that a little bit as well. So I can imagine in cocktail bars. So I can kind of see why it does quite well. Probably in America, probably in Irish bars, Irish cocktail bars. I can imagine this does an absolute bomb because of its name and the fact that as a mixing whiskey, it's got what you need. There's a little bit of sweetness in there. There's a little bit of juiciness in there. There's some sharpness in there that's going to cut through whatever you're mixing it with, but it's not too overpowering. It's got the warmth that you would need to kind of finish off your cocktail. Drinking neat, it's okay. It's not too bad, actually. It's a lot better than I thought, given I was kind of already a little bit unsure about it simply because of the jokey name. But it's, if you got given a bottle of this, it's drinkable. It's not fantastic, but it's not that bad at all. It's okay. It's all right, but it's definitely more of a mixing whiskey. Yeah, which, as somebody that has gone through every whiskey on the channel so far, drinking neat and looking at it neat as a whiskey on its own, could be a negative, but recognizing that there have been a lot of whiskies through this, you know, the Canadians particularly, and some of the blended whiskies as well, that they're not really made to be drunk neat. They're made to be mixed and in cocktails and things like that. You've got to kind of look at it in two parts in terms of neat whiskey, it's okay, it's not too bad. Mixing whiskey, actually, do you know what? It does. Now, I don't really want that from a whiskey. I'm not looking, when I'm buying whiskey, I'm drinking it neat. But trying to look at it in terms of, right, you're putting this in cocktails, you're mixing this with Coke and soda and things like that. Actually, it kind of ticks those boxes in terms of flavour profile, sweetness, enough sharpness to cut through, or enough of a flavour profile to cut through, not get masked by whatever you put with it. Does what you need. Does what you need indeed. 29 quid. Is it 29 quid? No, 26 quid. Feels a little bit steep, to be honest. It feels like it should be lower end of the 20s, you know, maybe even 20 quid, particularly for that flavour. Yeah, arguably slightly too steep for the price, but we'll see. It might be that actually that's a fair price as we run through all the other Irish whiskies. Right, I'm going to do a quick rinse out and then we shall crack on with another Irish. See you then. Cheers.